Don't worry, yeah. Okay, folks, let's get back to it. Okay, let's get more specific. All right, that's as abstract as I'm going to get. So I hope that was some out. In the vast majority of debates, you need to have, well, the rules don't say this, but in practice, you need to have a model. Now, yes, everyone makes a joke about model and blah, blah, blah. Let's move on. So, what you need from that model, a model is a specific explanation for what you would do about the problem. Not the rhetoric, not the high level, not the principle, not the we would have more accountability, not more efficiency, but the specific, practical, logistical thing you would do to deliver that outcome. Right? It's the rules, it's the amount of money you would spend, it's who you would kill. Now, depending on which choice you make about how to set up your model, the debate can be fundamentally different. And that choice is really one about a spectrum of options between taking a soft line or taking a hard line. And even though in both cases you're debating the same thing, the same side of the same topic, making fairly similar kinds of arguments, the debate will play out very differently depending on which of these choices you make. So, what's the difference? Well, the difference between a hard line and a soft line is really the difference between how much your model, your proposal, is different than the status quo. If you're proposing a big change to the way we do things now, then you're proposing a hard line. If you're proposing to make a small change to the way we do things now, then you're proposing a soft line. Now, when I say soft and hard, I'm not talking about how difficult it is to make the argument for these. Okay, that's a different issue. In fact, you'll usually find, perversely, that the harder the line, the easier it is to defend and debate, as a general rule. Okay? I'm talking about how big a shift is your model from what people do and understand and accept now. So, what I've got here is just a very simple sketch of 3 models, each of which would be a valid case for an affirmative team to run on the topic that we support euthanasia. Sorry about this house stuff, it's a bad habit that all debaters get into. But the topic needs to just be written as that we support euthanasia, or that Australia should have legalised euthanasia or something. Now, all 3 of these are affirmative team cases. Okay, they're all pro-euthanasia, but to very different extents. And really what it boils down to is, the difference between them is the balance of risk versus reward. So the softer the line you're taking, the less risk you as the affirmative team are prepared to take, that your opponents will be able to show that your model is flawed and that people might get hurt. To be blunt, that the wrong people will die. The people who shouldn't die through euthanasia will. That's the risk. So if you take a soft line, you're saying, we're going to take almost no risk. Right? We're going to set up so many barriers and restrictions that it's going to be very hard for the wrong people to get access to euthanasia. The flip side of that is, it will also be very hard for the right people to get access to euthanasia. The hardline position is obviously the opposite. If you want to grant more access, if you want to make euthanasia available to a wider range of people who might want it, then you have to accept that with that goes a higher risk that people you didn't really intend to be able to access euthanasia will. And how much of that risk you take on determines how potent the attacks from your opponent will be and how much work you'll have to do to defend yourself against them. So, just to be really quick about that, the soft line of this is restricted to very sick people who are very close to death with no possible hope of a cure or a decent standard of living, right? In other words, these are people who, even without euthanasia, will be dead pretty soon. Right? These are people absolutely on their last legs. So already that's restricting it down, right, to a very small number of people who have almost died but not quite yet. Secondly, you need multiple doctors and psychologists, you need shitloads of people to say that you were of sound mind when you made this decision, that you weren't so whacked out on painkillers, you weren't so delusional from your illness, you weren't so depressed from the state of your terminal illness, that you actually knew what you were doing. And you need multiple people to sign off on that. One's not enough. Right? You need a board of people to do it. And finally, only allows passive euthanasia, which means, someone? Yeah, right. It basically means you stop feeding them. And you might turn off life support. But you don't do anything active to harm them, to end their life. Right? You just stop helping to keep them alive. So it's slow, and it's not particularly nice. Even if they're in a coma, for example, starving to death's not great. It's not fun to watch. The second line is to say, okay, that's a bit restrictive, right? Hardly anyone's going to be able to go through the kind of euthanasia process under that rule. So we'll open it up a bit more. We'll say they don't have to be very close to death. They just have to have a very low standard of living. So these are people with high pain, high chronic illnesses, right? But not necessarily people that are going to die soon. People who might limp on for months or years because their illness, while eventually fatal, isn't rapidly fatal, but their quality of life is very low. Now, think of people who have the worst kinds of cancer, right? Things like bowel cancer and stomach cancer are horrible things to endure, but they can take years to kill you if the treatments start early and are aggressive and you're lucky, depending on your definition of lucky. It might take years, and you might decide you don't want to wait years, you want to go a bit sooner. Okay, then you're in this. You need a doctor and a psychologist, but not multiples of them, right? You just need one. That's obviously a lot easier. And the doctor's allowed to help you. Okay, you can see how this opens up the door a bit wider. But that makes it easy for people to say, if there's only one doctor who has to decide that you're terminal, and only one psychologist who has to decide that you're mentally capable, then that's very easy for them to get that wrong. There's no double check. And the final option is to be aggressive. To say, if the point of euthanasia is to give people control and choice over the circumstances and the timing of their death, and it's about people whose standard of living is so low, or is likely to be so low in the near future, they don't want to endure it, why would you limit it just to physical pain? Why is physical pain so unendurable, but the fear of kind of neurological degradation doesn't count? I don't know about you, but as a massive geek, I'm much more afraid of losing my brain than I am of my body wearing out. That's fair enough, right? A lot of people would say, at least with something like cancer or whatever, at least with something like a terminal illness, at least I've got my mind, right? I can talk to my family and friends, I can make arrangements, I can enjoy some of the things I like, I can read, I can listen to music, I can watch movies, and I can experience things. But when you lose your mind, even if you haven't lost your body, well, is it still you? Like once you've forgotten all your family and friends, once you're so demented that you're not sure what planet you're on anymore, sure, you're alive, but in what sense are you you? And in what sense does that matter? So for a lot of people, maybe that's worse. And maybe if you knew that you had a disease, which right now you can still remember all your family and friends and your favourite books and every naked person you've ever seen, all that's still up there. But you know that in the next 6 to 12 months, that will all be gone. Do you want to make a deal now that in 3 months' time, you're going to switch off? Maybe. And why should that be any less valid a choice than I'm going to be dead in 6 months and I want to, like excruciating pain, and I want to make the choice now to end it? If we believe in choice, and we believe people should have dignity in their death, then why is there only physical dignity? Why not mental dignity as well? But that's a much more aggressive case, right, with huge risks. Once you start talking about people who know and who are diagnosed to have neurological illnesses, people who by definition have a degree of impairment intellectually, of which there is no effective and kind of pinpoint test, then you're opening yourself up. Saying, how do you know for sure that these people who are saying, I know what I'm doing when I make this choice, how do you know for sure that they do? Difficult, right? And of course you can change the rules about how they do it to make it even easier as well. Now, all of that being said, what you're probably thinking is, well, fuck all that stuff, that's really hard. This sounds pretty easy. Right? The soft line sounds like a pretty safe bet. If I say, you've got to be really, 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 really sick, it's got to be no doubt at all. I mean, people, like every doctor in the world would agree that you are going to be dead probably within hours, probably while I'm explaining how you're going to be dead soon. Then what's the big deal, right? So what? Maybe I get it wrong. Maybe you weren't mentally competent. And maybe I robbed you of like 20 minutes. But you were terminally ill and in shitloads of pain anyway, so it's a mercy kill. Right? So how are you as the opposition team going to take me down? Now, that sounds very appealing, but let me give you a piece of advice. It's also shit boring, and there's very few arguments after those things I just said. Like that's it, like that's the case. There'll be hardly any risk, hardly any of the wrong people will ever go through. Sure, only a tiny number of people will benefit, but like, you know, one person being better off is better than none, right? No, not in debating. Because remember what I said at the start, debates are about problems. And the problem has to be worthy, right, of everyone's time. And to stand down and say, we, as the hypothetical parliament of people, are here to debate the problems of one sick person is not worthy of the time. Right? The problem in a debate is how do we give dignity and respect to people who are in the final stages of their life. People, plural, not a small number of individuals. Okay? It's what's called the problem-solution gap. The more effort you make to explain the problem, to say, the problem in society today is thousands of people every day are confronted with the news that they are now, that they now have a terminal disease that will definitely kill them. And not only that, it will be agonising and degrading. That not only will they suffer incredible pain, but they may not be able to eat, they may not be able to control their bowels, they may not be able to walk, they may be riddled with bed sores that become infected, they may lose the power of speech, and any number of other indignities. And the point of this debate is to figure out how do we do the most help for those people? They're the ones in need. And surely our society should be judged by how we help those people. Now, that sounded awesome, I reckon. But the problem is, once you've then said that, and you set up that first model, you haven't come anywhere near to meeting your own burden. You haven't helped all of those people who are suffering indignity and pain. You've helped a tiny number of them. So the debate's just way too narrow. So what you need to do is find the right balance, the balance that's right for your team, for your skills, for the arguments you can make for this exact topic that you're facing and your opponents. Right? Every debate's a bit different. It doesn't mean you should always pick the hard line, but I can tell you that you should err on the side of being kind of moderate to hard in the vast majority of debates. That's just the best place to be. Any questions? Now, yes?
Should all this be kind of done behind the scenes, or can you be explicit about what line you're going to say?
It doesn't really matter. I mean, what matters is what you say your model is. I mean, that's what you'll be judged against. So, I mean, I'd never come out and say, hey, we're taking a soft line, because that's the same adjudicators. Hey, I'm about to waste an hour of your time. How do you feel about that? So I probably wouldn't do that. But if you're going to take a hard line, I don't think there's any reason not to say it. It's going to be pretty obvious. Right? So you say, look, this is a big problem, and what we're going to propose is a pretty radical solution, right? Definition of hard line is it's a big change from the status quo, so by definition that's a radical change. So yeah, we're going to propose a pretty radical change, but stay with us, folks, because this is really going to help a lot of people. This is going to save a lot of lives, it's going to make a lot of people's lives better. Like, I think it's fine to be upfront about it. Also, opposition teams should have models as well, particularly when if the affirmative team has a model, it's almost imperative for the negative team too. And the rules don't say that, just in 1 second. The rules don't say that, but let me give you this tip. If you're the negative team and your opponents have a model, let's say one of those, and there's a negative team who don't have a model, by default, you will end up defending the status quo. Now, that might be fine, right? You might be very happy to defend the status quo. It might be the best option you can think of, or it might just be the best option. But you might as well be explicit about that, okay? Because a lack of clarity is a killer in debates. The moment an adjudicator is unclear about exactly where you stand in the kind of macro sense, what's your total position, the bigger trouble you're in. So it's far better off to say, look, our opponents have this very fancy model of pro-euthanasia. That's great, we understand it, we're going to engage with that. Let's just be clear, we're for the status quo. Right? We're for the way things are now, where we throw as much resources as we can at palliative care, we try as hard as we can to make people as comfortable as we can. We do not sanction the state taking the life of its citizens, regardless of their health. Right? That's fine, just say it. Just say it straight up. Yep.
Is there like a generic strategy for the majority of the cases? Like if your opposition does a really hard line, should you go for a more soft line, or should you go for just as hard line?
Yeah, it's a really good example. The first thing I'd say as a generic test is you must always create space. Right? There must always be a clear amount of space in the debate. So the softer your opponents go, the harder you kind of have to go to create that gap. Because if you're going to be pro-status quo, which is kind of here, and they're going to be here, like it's going to be really hard for you to eke out 6 speeches where there's anything worth saying in that debate, because the difference between you is so pissant that it's not worth the effort. So in that case, you do as much as you reasonably could to create space. You can't always, because sometimes there's nowhere further for you to kind of back off. But if you can, that's a good thing to do. If your opponents take a hard line, it doesn't mean you automatically have to take a hard line in response, but generally what you want to do is kind of, the harder their line is, the more space that creates for you, because once they've said, okay, we have to make a big change from the status quo, they can't then criticise you for taking a big change to the status quo, so they've kind of given you that sort of license in the debate to also make a big change, so that gives you basically you can make as much change as they are, but in the opposite direction, without them being able to say, whoa, that's too radical.